We've had some great people here with us this year, including Joy James, who we co-sponsored with the Haven Center with, and it's Jose Antonio Vargas, who we co-sponsored with the LGBT Campus Center, and I can't keep playing with that. So we also had Rinku Sen here from the Applied Research Center, and Tom Goldtooth, who we co-sponsored a program with the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies. And so we've had some really interesting conversations. We also had one of our own, Aida Hassan from the Department of English, sharing some of her research around slave narratives and neo-slave narratives. And then last night, if you were here, you heard the most amazing talk ever. I already love Dr. Monica White, but I just love her more. That talk was amazing. If you were here, you know that it was amazing. If you weren't, feel bad. It was amazing. But it was recorded, so hopefully in some way we'll get to share it with those of you who missed it. And if you're a student and you graduate and you don't take a class with her, phooey on you, because she's amazing. So, and this morning we have a table full of other really amazing people. And there's still some weirdness with this volume, and can we get a technical person to come? Right, thank you. So, I'm not really caffeinated, but I'm acting like I am, so we'll see what happens. And by the way, my name is Dante Hilliard, and I am the Assistant Dean of Students and Director of the Multicultural Student Center. I guess I should introduce myself. Thank you. And along with me, so in our conversation about race and place, this event is our capstone event. And in the opening plenary, my idea was to have several of the guests who are here with us for the day to open up the day by offering their own reflections around the relevancy of the theme from where they sit in their social location, in their work, in their research agenda, in their activism. And it also serves as a way to sort of give you a sort of glimpse of some of the interests and work and personalities that'll be offering workshops throughout the day. If you haven't decided whose workshop you'd like to be in, this is a chance to do that. Also a chance to meet some folks who may not be offering workshops, but also get to be introduced to their work and what they do. And I am a connector. I love bringing amazing people together to have amazing conversations and maybe being inspired to go out and do other amazing things. So, we have a table full of really amazing people here, all of whom I cannot say too many good things about, so I'm not going to do it because then we'll never get through this. So they will introduce themselves to you in the way that they feel comfortable, and they're going to just share their reflections on from where they sit, what is the relevancy of the theme, the concept of race and place. And if we have some time at the end, hopefully they'll share and maybe they'll engage each other. You never know when you get educated folks together, right? They might engage each other, and also hopefully we can engage you as well, who are here gathered with us this morning. So with that said, I'm going to sit down and we'll just start somewhere at the table, whoever feels the spirit.
Anybody feel the spirit? Oh. Anyone else want to start? You want this? How do you want to do it?
Any way you
Maybe
need
one of these is better.
Yeah, feel free.
I don't know if people can see us in the back.
Oh, we could stand? Hello? Oh, that's a little better. Yeah. Oh, oh, sorry. But I have this one. Will they put that one back? Okay. Okay. All right.
As long as you ask nicely.
Race and place.
Hand, Becky, hand.
And gender. It's getting hot in here. Okay.
Go on, Dr.
I'm waiting on, I don't know if he wants me to wait. Oh, I can go. Okay. All right.
Use that microphone.
Okay, can everybody hear me? Okay, great. My name is Lisa Brock, and I am the academic director of the Arcus Center for Social Justice Leadership at Kalamazoo College. Interestingly, I know Dante from my years at Columbia College. He actually taught in my department, the Department of Humanities, History, and Social Sciences there. So it's kind of like old home week here with Dante. He's been doing this particular work in social justice in terms of in academia and in an institute longer than I have, but I think I've probably been an activist longer than he has. I'm older than he is. So my comments today, the question that was posed to us by Dante was why race and place? Why this topic for today? So I'll just give you some introductory comments and then we can go from there. I have many memories of race and place. Growing up in a small town in southern Ohio, where by law blacks could only live in certain parts of the town, and by custom, there were white spaces and black spaces. There were rich spaces and poor spaces. The white kids I went to school with could possibly come to my home to play, but rarely was I allowed to go to their place to play, which was always very interesting to me. One friend of mine by the name of Ann Cook, we actually had a Batman club when we were 7 or 8 years old. I'm dating myself. That was when the TV show was on and we all wanted to be Batman, even though we were girls. And Ann came to my house to play so we could have club meetings. It was just the two of us in the club. You know how that happens. And we were going to have a club meeting at my house, and she would come to my house for club meetings. And then my mother said, well, when are you going to go to Ann's house? And I said, I don't know. So I asked Ann, I said, well, when are we going to have a club meeting at your house? And she quite innocently told me that her father did not allow nigger kids in her yard or in her house. So I told my mother what Ann said. Ann said her father doesn't allow nigger kids in her yard or in her house. And my mother said, well, you're not a nigger, but I think we need to disband the Batman Club. So her place was off limits to me because of my race, yet my community was welcoming to her because of her race. So the notion, or not because of her race, but because she was a human being. So the notion of place as race has a strong resonance for me, as I'm sure it does for many, if not most, African Americans or other marginalized and oppressed people. It has shaped where we feel safe and where we live, where we can speak our mind and be happy and free in our skin and our culture, and where we cannot. The same has been true of other peoples of color in other places and times. In fact, when I think of the Land Acts of South Africa, which attempted to force South Africa's black population into 13% of the land, and the Trail of Tears in this country, which forcibly forced hundreds of thousands of American Indians from the east to the western part of the United States in order to open up land for white settlement, and the Treaty of Guadalupe, which took the western part of the United States from Mexico and then deemed many of the people who moved back and forth across that border between what was the southwestern part of the country and Mexico, deemed them illegal. And then the Atlantic slave trade from the 1500s to the late 19th century, which forcibly moved more than 15 million Africans from Africa to the Americas against their will. It is clear that the title of this symposium speaks to huge processes in history: race and place, movement, space, land, and power. I'm a historian, I must confess. And I'm a historian of the African diaspora. But I am also a radical historian and try to see connections between the past and the present. In fact, I call myself a back to the future historian. I try to look to the past to better understand the present so that we can help make a better, more just future. And I try to see the world in a global perspective, even though as a historian we have to focus on a specific area. But I think by having a broad enough lens, we are able to see connections that often those in power try to deny us. So my presentation later this afternoon is in this vein. And it's really just a beginning of some of the work I'm trying to think about in terms of bringing some of my thoughts and my research together. So my research has begun on historic Charleston, South Carolina, where I'm looking at the mid-19th century and looking at radical black people in Charleston, South Carolina, especially radical dock workers. So I'm connecting that research with my teaching on apartheid South Africa. And I'm connecting that to my frustration with the so-called immigration debates, with such a limited, ignorant, and ill-informed discursive strategy. Interestingly, across these places, spaces, and times, that is apartheid South Africa, 19th century Charleston, and today's immigration discussion, I have found some interesting sets of parallels. In all three, the economic desire for a super exploitable labor source, which is driven to maximize profit, requires that this sector of black and brown workers in the 19th century, the mid-20th century, and now the 21st century are denied their basic human and citizenship rights in the places where they live, have families, and have to work. In fact, they're lured to these places in these times. Africans were brought to work. South Africans were forced as migrant laborers to work. And now we have immigrant labor coming from Mexico, desperate and in need of work. And each of the capital and power structures of these places want them, invite them, need them to maintain their societies. So that they desire them on the one hand and set up structures of hate on the other. So it's this interesting space between desire and whiteness, desire and hate, desire and exploitation that I'm trying to pursue in my talk, which I will give this afternoon, in which workers must be, in order to live in this strange place, tagged, regulated, policed, marked with badges, passes, and documents. Oh my. Thank you.
Actually, I'll just wing this. My name is Townsand Price-Spratlen. I'm a faculty member in the Department of Sociology at Ohio State University. And I've known Dante for many years. He was a graduate student at Ohio State when I had just arrived there as new faculty. And I'd like to thank the Institute for Justice, Education, and Transformation, the Multicultural Student Center, and Dante Hilliard for this opportunity to share ideas with you. The focus of my research is on community capacity building as a theme, and I'm interested in both historical and contemporary expressions of the ways in which individuals, collectives, and communities come together to nurture and maximize assets to enhance well-being outcomes. And I'd like to explore one piece of that research primarily with you today, because that's a very global set of ideas. Let's get more specific. When justice has a location, what does it look like? When justice has a pattern, what do those patterns appear as? And when justice is a strategy, what do people do? Location, pattern, strategy. Let's explore them through the lens of the prison industrial complex, because that's what I'm focusing on right now. I just recently published a book, Reconstructing Rage, Transformative Reentry in the Era of Mass Incarceration. And the focus of that book, with my co-author, William Goldsby, was to explore that process of community capacity building in the era of mass incarceration. We are in it, and all of us are of it. So why study race and place? Because race is a social construction. If anybody's seen Race, the Power of an Illusion from California Newsreel, if you haven't, please do, because it's a wonderful set of representations and explorations of race, the social construction of race, the meanings we assign to how you look. It's not just, it's not just how we look, it's the meaning we assign to how we look. As Dr. Brock clearly illustrated, in the nature of the Batman Club. It's not how you look that defines your membership or access to meeting place. It's how meaning is assigned to how you look, and then the material and symbolic consequences thereof that follow. So race is a social construction with very real consequences. They interact to shape life outcomes in profound ways, as it was poignantly represented. Race disparities are often the result of place-related differences. Race, what we know as race disparities, are often the result of place-related differences. In other words, in a city like Columbus, where I live and work, there's a relatively large proportion of working-class whites. And so it's possible, as well as middle-class, cross-class whites, cross-class African-Americans, and a growing Latino population. So it's possible to disaggregate and compare areas of criminality, areas of health disparity, areas of educational performance, et cetera, and with comparably class-concentrated, situated neighborhoods. And when you look at those contrasts and compare them, often race, quote unquote, race or ethnic differences reduce to non-significance or completely disappear. So race disparities are often a result of place or class-specific differences, and those disparities often vary by location. So the example that I just gave is when place and class are controlled, then disparities often reduce to non-significance or completely disappear. So why explore race and place? Because from a standpoint of imprisonment, the U.S. is the carceral leader globally, right, as we know. No one locks up its folk like this nation state does. And there's worth in exploring place-related differences in the imposition of the carceral state, because it varies. So, for example, the rate of African-American male imprisonment is 7 times that of whites nationally, white men nationally. The Latino rate is about 3 times that of whites nationally. So there's variation by race ethnicity alone nationally. When you look more closely at this state that we are in, the disparities are magnified nationally 7-to-1, African American to white. In the state of Wisconsin, about 12-to-1. And that's because the white imprisonment rate is very low, and the African American imprisonment rate is extremely high, and the Latino white difference is consistent with national average, about 3 times greater. So again, their place matters, because when you look at Wisconsin, net of the net in the United States, then the racial disparities go up. So much closer to home, let's deal with something real. Dane County, where we're sitting and standing. Dane County, when you look specifically in particular at drug arrests, again, remember the African-American imprisonment rate relative to white males is 7-to-1, considering the local. In Dane County, that comparable percentage, that comparable proportion for drug-related arrests is 97-to-1. 97-to-1. Place matters a lot. Depending upon where you are, the engagement of imprisonment's risk is either high or extraordinarily high. Race, place, disparity. Point. Race and place matter. They inform life outcomes in profound ways. The prison industrial complex and the examples that I just gave are one brief example of the kinds of ideas that we'll explore in the closing plenary in greater detail, and more critically, how are we living the solution? We can describe the problem with great detail, and that's what social sciences, I'll take responsibility for my own discipline. That's what sociologists are very good at. We can explain and explore, and how are we living a solution? And so we'll explore in the closing, at lunch, and then in the closing plenary, how we're living that solution. And we'll just celebrate one example. Reconstruction Incorporated is what the book focuses upon. Reconstruction Incorporated is an organization in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, that was founded by a two-time violent felon who was a longtime friend of mine, and in association with the American Friends Service Committee. Want to give them a shout out as well. AFSC has a complicated history because the Quakers and the Society of Friends actually started prisons, as well as, they held slaves as well as being abolitionists. It was a very complicated history. But the point is that AFSC played a critical role. There's a significant justice arm of them, of the Society of Friends, or Quakers, called AFSC. They are their justice arm. And Reconstruction Incorporated began as a justice initiative within that organization. We'll explore those themes, living in the solution and the role of former felons as primary assets in justice transformation. Not addenda, not as primary assets, leaders in the nurturing of a possible justice where we live and breathe. Race, place, and location. Look forward to exploring those ideas with you further. Thanks.
Becky Martinez, but please call me Becky. I'm still getting used to the doctor, although I've had it for a few years. I don't really know what that means. And so I'm still figuring out it. What I do know it means is people treat me a whole heck of a lot differently, which is fascinating, right? And I'm a consultant. I'm a scholar practitioner. I've had the grace to work with Dante through the Social Justice Training Institute, which holds a place in my heart. So what I'd actually ask you to do is I want you to close your eyes, and I want you to think about, when you hear race and place, what does that mean to you? You know, as you think about your day, your daily lives, like, what does race mean? Because we can throw that out, but I want you to just close your eyes. And what pops up for you when you think about race, when it comes to you? And I want you to be grounded in that. And then I want you to think of one word, one feeling word. So let's get out of our heads, right? So a feeling word that is associated with race as you are in that space. And then you can open your eyes when you're ready. So we'd like to hear from, I'm still going to wait for some folks because they're still in the space of their eyes closed, which I think is, which I appreciate. So what are some of those words?
Performance.
Performance.
Class.
Class. Anxiety.
Isolation.
Isolation. Conflict.
Rage.
Rage.
Confusion.
Confusion. Repression. Huh?
Anger.
Anger. Deep breath. Another deep breath. So I have the opportunity to do this across the country and talk about social justice, race, class, ableism, sexism, and I love the work. And I think race has such a salient place in this country that, that it's much more overt and out there than the other stuff. And the other stuff matters. And so I was talking to Dante earlier about, you know what, thanks for bringing me in as a bi-mixed person. right, as a biracial mixed person, because I think when we talk about race, it's often in the binary, right? So black, white. Then it's often monoracial, right? So then Latinos, Natives, Asians, Arabs, Arab Americans, and then we get to the mixed folks. And so one, please don't forget us. And two, let's think about how race impacts us. And so my work is, how has race impacted me to then show up in the world, right? And so what have I internalized, and what do I still internalize? You know, as a woman of color, and I can't separate those. I know, you know, if we talk about race, okay, as a person of color, but woman of color just speaks to me more. And I recognize the privilege of being cisgender in that space. So if we think about gender identity and expression, that language is easy for me to say and sometimes difficult for people to hear if they don't fit in the binary around gender, right? And holding multiple truths, and I still am a woman of color, right? And so as we think about race, what does that mean, right? And how I interact with folks, and how I think about people that are in other marginalized communities of race, because I've learned some stuff, right? And so how does that pop up in conversations? Like, the black folks, are they getting all the, if I start playing the race Olympics, right? Are they getting all the attention, and how does that make me feel? Or how do I feel as a result of that, right? You know, what about being mixed and people don't see that I'm Asian? And what does that mean? You know, I'm going to give a keynote on racism on college campuses in a couple of days at East Carolina University. And so I put on Facebook, you know, because I want some data. Put on Facebook, because, you know, that's where we get some data, right? And I said, hey, what do you think about this? And like, within an hour, I got all these responses of how it's still alive and well, how it plays out on campuses, how we in academia use jargon to distance ourselves from it. Microaggressions. Ugh. As a working class person, that annoys the hell out of me. I'm like, because really it just means like, it means you being treated like crap.
Right.
Right? But we've got an academic word called microaggressions, and so now that distances us from how it plays out in the world. Right? And if I get enough microaggressions, I can get really pissed off. Right? Cumulative impact. Right? And then I show up in certain ways, and then I'm labeled certain ways. And so I think today, let's get out of our heads, right? And it's important to be, because we're in academia, I got lots of degrees, right? And let's think about how it plays out as we think about the prison industrial complex, right? And as I hear those statistics, right, what that means to me with the people that are in my lives, right? Because I think that as we think about race and place, it's, how is that playing out in our communities? And how are we shifting that so that we have voice and we have power? And last night from Dr. White's conversation is, and then how do we heal? How do we heal around race? Instead of being so angry, right? Instead of being confused, instead of being ignorant, instead of being entitled. How do we empower and liberate ourselves from that space so that we shift the race dynamics so that I don't have to hear those statistics on a daily basis, so that I don't have to be afraid of my nephew when he drives through Arizona. Right? So thank you, Dante, for bringing me in this space and having the opportunity to talk about mixed race. And so we're going to do that in a session. And so, one, the first premise is for mixed folks to be able to be in the same space, because we don't get this very often, right? And I realize there might not be a lot of mixed folks here, right? And so, so the first part is, hey, it's for us to get together to have conversation. If you're monoracial, you can join it in knowing that, there may be some spaces that may be uncomfortable you in that conversation or new. And then we're going to do another, Dante and I are actually together going to do something around people of color being allies to other people of color. Deep breath on that one. Because I think that we got some stuff to work out. And so thank you for your time. Remember that feeling word throughout your day and see if it shifts as you're connecting with other people, as you're learning the head intellectual stuff, which is important, and then connect it to your heart and your hands, right? And so I think race and place is about head, heart, hand work. And how are we shifting dynamics so that we all have voice and power. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Kaleem Caire. I'm the president and CEO of the Urban League of Greater Madison here, and native Madisonian. My family has been here in Madison on the Caire side since 1907, and on the Thomas side, my grandmother's side, since 1931. We have seen Wisconsin through its many changes and iterations during that time. But the meaning of this conference, Race and Place, to me, I'll frame it to you in this way. In Madison, Wisconsin, having grown up here and having had a family that's been here so long, I realized in order to be black and successful and succeed and keep your sanity, you have to be a liar. When I was in Washington, D.C., in Prince George's County, Maryland, which is the wealthiest black county in America, it's the only place where the wealth of African Americans exceeds that of whites, I had to be a pretender. But when I was in France, for 1 day, 2 days, I was in the military, I could be free. So let me explain that to you. My family came here, my uncle Samuel Pierce, great-great-uncle, grandfather's uncle, brought the family here. He was a porter on the Northwest Railway train, which ran from Mississippi to California first, then Mississippi to Chicago. That's why so many black folks are in Chicago, that great migration. They were a part of it. And then he became the leader of the dignitary card. So Bob La Follette and all the great people in American history from the upper Midwest, he staffed that car and took them from Chicago through Madison to Minneapolis. He was getting older. He wanted to take up residence, so he took up residence at 1454 East Williamson Street. The house is still there. Brought his mother here, who died here. She's the oldest person ever died in Wisconsin, although we can't get that recorded because slaves didn't have birth certificates. But she was 115 years old. And when she died here in 1944, she outlived all her family members. I was born here in 1971. My mother, even though we've had, family members who've been in esteemed roles, Hetty Pierce was her name. Her husband served in the Louisiana legislature after Reconstruction from 1867 to 1869. Blacks took over the Louisiana legislature almost. So we've had that history, but in all that history, we were always fairly broke, fairly poor. My mother had me here out of wedlock. She lived most of her life in the bus shelter outside of Starbucks on State Street when it was the big old bus shelter. She was a beautiful woman, but often the poster child for homeless people in Wisconsin. My father, I learned after I met him in 2004, he was in and out of prison at that point 7 times. He went back 1 time since then. He's 75 years old, still struggles with alcoholism. He was a pimp. He wrote over 1 million bad checks, he told me. He did a lot of things when he was younger. So I've lived that life as a young person, having grown up with my aunt, not with my own parents, that a lot of our young people live with today. But in Madison, I started to understand my struggle as a child when I became an adult here and started to understand, and really at this university, trying to understand the influence of race on our lives. And so those statistics are mirror images of my family and of my friends. And I grew up in South Madison. I can still only count 5, including Percy Brown, who's a brother of ours, 5 brothers from either 3 years ahead of me or 3 years before me who graduated from college. And I had 74 people's names written. That's it. So a few of them didn't finish. I saw my first murder, a double homicide, right out there in front of my house. Woman with her head half cut off, I found her. So I've lived that life that some kids have to go to other cities like Chicago, et cetera, to experience. But in Madison, in order for me, excuse me, to share my story with people and to also help people understand why I do what I do, why I fight for social justice so hard, why I believe in being independent. I value my independence. I value Kujichagulia. I value Sankofa. Looking back to the past, I value being me. Madison's frightened of that. And so people have seen over the last several months, last couple of years, how we have pushed at the Urban League for Madison to address its issues in ways that it never has before. And Madison has done what it usually does. It has pushed back hard, lied about me, lied about the organization, tried to pit our own people against us, because they can't take seeing a black man with the will and the courage and the experience and background who's from here to tell them that they're wrong. So the way we survive here is by wearing that mask and grinning and lining and gritting and skinning. Because if you don't have ability to be accommodating here in Madison, Wisconsin, then your life will be a struggle. So I learned that. I learned in D.C., though, when I got there, I was the president of a national organization, barely graduated high school at 18, 17 years old, president of a national organization at 28 in Washington. And I went out there with the greatest of vigor. I had met my wife at Hampton University, so I had spent some time out there. But when I went back, I was like, yes, I'm going to be around my people. But then I emerged in a role where I had a lot of influence, a lot of visibility, but a lot of my work took place among the upper echelon of Washington, D.C. And when I finally got there, I realized there were very few of us there, too. The old Ebony magazines and all that stuff, they show about us doing well. We're doing well down at the mid-level management level. You get to the upper level, there aren't that many of us. But I realized that we looked good, we drove nice cars, we had beautiful homes. Prince George's County is the best manufactured experiment for black wealth in American society, where we have money, but we have no power. We don't own any of the land, really, except the land we might have our house on. And since the foreclosure hit, we see how little we owned, really. Because that was a big area where we lost a lot of wealth and a lot of homes. But out there, I could pretend to be successful and I could get by. When I was in France for those 2 days, it shocked me. When I got off the boat, I was a submariner, sonar technician on submarines out of high school. And we went and we took a train from Toulon, France, into some of these little towns and had to make our way back. We stopped at what I now know was a wine bar, Was shocked they had no alcohol. It was all wine, right? And I'm gonna stop here, but the bartender was Pakistani, and I was shocked that they had. I thought Europe was gonna be nothing but white people, right? And all these people were in there, and when I walked in, people sort of, they glanced, but nobody was really staring at you. And so we're sitting at the bar, and they're all speaking the language that I can't speak. And so these guys, there were two other guys with me, and the gentleman came up, and he spoke to us in French, and then he smiled, and he started speaking to us in English. And I was like, whoa, you speak English? He said, of course. He said, most of us do, right? And so we started striking up this conversation, and all the time we were there, people were more interested in the fact that I was from America. They wanted to know what it was like to be black in America because they had heard a lot of things about us and everything. But it was the first time where I didn't feel like my race carried a penalty. It's the first time I felt like I didn't have to smile and skin and grin or pretend. And so I think that this conference is so important and the subject is so important, and we really should have all of Madison's leaders in here because they don't look like much of us in here, I tell you that. But to have them be a part of this conversation too, and what does it mean to be white in Madison? If you're white, you're right, right? If you're black, get back. If you're yellow, you're mellow. You know what I'm saying? If you're brown, stick around. We all remember that. We all remember that. So that's what it means to me, you guys. You know, we either skinning and grinning, or suffering, trying to be free, or we're pretending to be somebody that we're not, and internally we'll never really feel like we are safe, like we are who we are. But we got to leave this country to do that. Something's wrong with that. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Colleen Butler, and I am the Racial Justice Director at the YWCA in Madison. And when I try to think about what I could potentially bring to this, a lot of my background at the YWCA is actually having conversations about race in Madison, and I've had a lot of opportunity to hear from a lot of different people about what their experience is like around race in Madison. But I came to Madison from growing up in New York, and so when I think about race and place, for me, a lot of it has to do with a comparison of my experience growing up in New York and my experience growing up, or my experience as an adult in most of my career in Madison. And in New York, it wasn't like there was some sort of magical racial utopia, but race was always on the table. It was always something you could talk about. And it was also okay to argue with people or disagree or to sometimes come into conflict. But what I've discovered about talking about race in Madison, and maybe in the Midwest in general, but I've only been in Madison, is that you just can't talk about it, you know, and just talking about it is like creating the problem. And so that is what I've definitely experienced. When I think about race and place, you know, I think about my own experience as a white person in Madison. I moved to Madison for the same reason a lot of people move here, had a family going to grad school here. And I loved Madison when I moved here. I totally loved it. I loved the farmers markets. I loved going to concerts on the square. I was like, everybody should move here. It's so great. There's all these parks. Like, I'm that person. So, and I actually got people to move here. Like, people who didn't live here, I actually got them to come here because I was so excited about Madison. And so that was me when I moved here about 13 years ago. And I started working in social services. My first position was at an organization that doesn't exist anymore, but it was called Women's Transit Authority, and it was an organization that connected low-income people. My part of the position was to connect low-income people to their medical appointments. So I did quite a bit of driving, and when you're driving a van, you get a chance to hear a lot of stories. And the stories that I heard from the people that we were driving to their appointments were examples of experiences that were wildly different than my experience of Madison. And then the other piece that I experienced at that position was that I trained the volunteers. We had a lot of volunteers, good people, people who wanted to give back, be involved. And they were mostly white people, a lot of people from the university, but not necessarily everybody. And they had never driven to any of the neighborhoods that we were picking people up from. They didn't know where any of these places were. They didn't know any of the people who lived there. And it became clear to me over the course of that position that you could live as a white person in Madison and not know about a huge amount of what is happening here. It is super easy as a white person to not know a lot of stuff in Madison. And comfortable, really comfortable to be in that position. And then I went on to work at the YWCA, which is where I've been for the last 13 years. And I started there as a housing counselor. My position there was to find housing for all of the homeless families in our county shelter system. And I had 30 days to do that with 40 families at a time. And in that position, I had a mostly African-American clientele. About 80% of the families in shelter, and I'm talking about families, people with children, were African-American at that time. And what I experienced as a housing counselor, hustling, I mean, I was really just desperately trying to find places for people to live, was that I could have a family who had a ton of history in Dane County, felony convictions, evictions, bad credit, and if they were white, they could find some private landlord that would give them a second chance. And I could work with a woman who was African American who relocated to Madison, young, nothing bad on her record at all, but maybe no history, and people would use that to screen her out. Nobody would give her even a first chance, let alone a second chance. And so it started to become really clear to me that this thing that our city council president, Shiva B. Darciloff, talks about is the tale of two cities, the two different Madisons that are coexisting, one of which can know nothing about the other, and then the other knows everything about the main, part of the Madison community. And so that was really what fueled my interest in focusing on racial justice. And I started to realize that when I'm thinking about this conference topic, that how I feel is that race keeps us in our place in Madison. And I don't just mean it keeps low-income people of color in their place, but it keeps me in my place too. Everything that is here is set up for me, and I benefit from that regularly. And when I was at a point in my life and my career where I was going to be looking for a home or looking for preschool, I decided I really wanted to focus on trying to find some place where there would be some diversity. That was important to me. That's how I grew up, and it made me who I am. Like, it's really important to me. And it was really hard. Those places don't exist in Madison. There's not diverse communities. There are these communities and those communities, and even communities where there is some diversity are kind of separated in these imaginary lines. And I started to think about this image that's in Beverly Daniel Tatum's book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? And she has this image of two escalators, one going up and one going down. And the white people are on the up escalator, and all the people of color are trying to get to the same place, but they have to run up the down escalator. And the idea, of course, is that you're working against all of these systems to get to the same place. And that's how it felt trying to go against the stream of whiteness in Madison. It was actually much harder than just going with the flow and living in a neighborhood that has all people who look like me. So when I hear that Madison's acknowledged as one of the best places to live, at this point I always ask, for who? For who? For me, And the racial disparities in Madison are vast, and they are shameful. We should be ashamed of ourselves as a community. Dr. Townsand mentioned some of our terrible disparities around drug offenses, but right now the Wisconsin Council on Children and Families is doing a report called Race to Equity. It hasn't been released yet, but their preliminary data has shown that Madison's repeatedly ranked near the bottom in national studies on the extent of racial disparities in health, education, justice, and child welfare. And their preliminary review of the data suggested that African Americans in Dane County are 60 times more likely to be incarcerated, 13 times as likely to be in foster care, 3 times as likely to die in infancy, and half as likely to graduate high school as their white counterparts. I mean, that is terrible. That is terrible. We should be ashamed of ourselves. We have so many resources in this community. And it's painful. It's painful to think about the racial disparities because we really like to think of ourselves as this really great progressive community. So how could that be happening? How could that be happening if that's who we are? And so we don't want to talk about it because talking about it means we aren't who we think we are. And that's actually really a hard thing to imagine. And I also think white people are afraid. We're afraid to say the wrong thing. We're afraid of conflict. We're afraid to be wrong about who we think we are. And that leads to us staying silent. And I recently read an op-ed in the New York Times, which I recommend you all go read if you'd like. It's by Ta-Nehisi Coates, and it's called The Good Racist People. And that's, I think, kind of who we are here in Madison. We are well-intentioned, we're caring, good people, but as a community, we're disturbingly unaware, and our silence and our commitment to colorblindness is really devastating the health of our whole community. So I think the topic is critical to Madison. When we train people at Madison to have dialogues around racial justice, one of the things we talk about, or we give people a list of detours, things people say to get out of talking about race. And one of those things is geography. We sometimes will say, well, racism is a problem. I mean, that's why we're here, right? Because we know racism is a problem, but it's really a problem in Milwaukee, or it's really a problem in New Orleans, or wherever, but it's never a problem like on our street or in our neighborhoods or at our schools. And so, that is happening here all the time. And I, as somebody who does this work and has these conversations, just, really would like to charge Madison with waking up on this issue and becoming more conscious of the fact that we really can't be who we think we are if we continue to let these disparities go on. And I really believe that it's our commitment to this false idea of ourselves as a community and that systemic silence and silencing, which I think goes to what Kaleem was just talking about, that makes it virtually impossible for our community to make the critical systemic changes that are necessary for equity. So, thank you.
Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child, a long way from home, a long way from home. My name is Everett Mitchell, and I'm the Director of Community Relations here at UW-Madison. But I'm also a pastor here in this community. I pastor Christ of Solid Rock Baptist Church. And so my comments will be a little bit different than the other panelists. You have enough people here who can talk about racism and injustice in the system and inequality in Madison, all of which are important to me, and they resonate deep within the work that I have done in this community and I will continue to do. But the reason I started off with that song was because when Dante asked me about race and place and he asked me to speak, I knew he was talking about, give some comments about the criminal justice system. I was a prosecutor, I've done all this other stuff. But as a pastor, the first thing that brought up in me was, how can we talk about, as African Americans, about promoting justice when we don't have a black church in Madison that is open to lesbian and gay members of our community? And so I started to think as a pastor that I'm a hypocrite if I am challenging every system of white oppression to open up its doors and transform itself. But the moment that someone who is gay or lesbian comes into my midst, I turn it off and use the Bible as a bullet pulpit so that there is no space for people to come. I began to feel like the ultimate hypocrite. So when I think about race and place, I think about there has to be a place. And why isn't there a place in Madison for black churches to say to members of our community, regardless of your sexual orientation, guess what? You have a place to still be able to worship God. So I started thinking about that and what does that mean for me. So I picked up the book called Sweet Tea, Black Gay Men of the South, E. Patrick Johnson. I know Dante, thank you. And in that section, he calls it Church Sissies, Gayness, and the Black Church. And he talks about how the black church has no challenger to being the cultural womb of the black community. It has no challenger. And so as the black church has no challenger to being the cultural womb of the black community, it has been the place where people have fought for civil rights. It has been the place where people have started and began to move toward bringing about a vision of equity, not only for people of color, but also for a community that was denying people of color that space. But even within that space, there's this crazy hypocrisy, this sense that I can go out and fight for racial freedom and I can call white realities bad and unjust, but behind the closed doors of the veil of the black church, I can call people faggots, I can call them sissies, I can call them butch, I can call them punks, while at the same time opening up my mouth to say how good Jesus has been to me. About how God loves everybody, but he doesn't love those who are gay. And so I started to think, if we're going to talk about race and place, we got to always talk about race, but also places everywhere, not only that what white people have control over, but what black people have control over too. Because there are places that we have control over that we don't always create the space in our places for people to truly be free. right? And so I realized that if we're going to have a full discussion, let's bring everybody to the table. And let's begin to give a proper analysis to all spaces that happen for us. So what do I mean by that? I think at times I'm struggling because I'm trying to find an ideological connection between the freedom gospel and while at the same time making sure that my messages and our churches are not being an oppressive place where people can't find a sense of who they are. And I always have to preface this by saying that people sometimes try to say, well, because you are fighting so hard, and I've gotten these comments, you're fighting so hard for gays and lesbians only because you're a closeted homosexual yourself. Ain't that crazy? You know, and what I remind them is that, no, regardless of how I define myself, the issue is not about definition. The issue is about space, right? It's not about who defines what, how they define it. It's about making sure that there's a maintaining of that space. So how do I, as a pastor who pastors in this community, in my church, where there is no place in Madison where people can have this kind of conversation, how do I do it? Well, the first place I do it, I preach it. And so I don't say that I don't say that I have knowledge about what every issue that goes on in the LGBT community, but what I do know that in my church, what is preached will not be a message that oppresses and diminishes a space for people who want to be there. So I preach it. There's a homiletical moment in which black preaching gives the moment where the divine meets the reverence of the individual. And it is in that meeting place when the proclamation of the word goes forth that there is this kind of moving of the transformation where the Spirit is invited to come and tabernacle with the people. And so the wounds and the brokenness and the disparate races of minds and the confusion that people have felt the whole week are being brought back together again into that moment of symbolic breaking through of the Spirit, so people are touching the divine at that very moment. Right. And in that moment, I say, don't you ever say nothing bad about nobody who's gay or lesbian. Right. In that divine moment when they're feeling good about the Spirit, I tell them, don't you say to somebody who's gay or lesbian that they don't belong in this church. In that divine moment, right before they get ready to shout, I say, if you're going to shout, then you better make sure that you shout thanking God for every gay and lesbian person in your family, right? Because I want them to connect the Spirit that they say is liberating them from oppression to the idea that we can't join God's liberation if we're not actually liberating people who are being oppressed right now. And so what I'm trying to get them to see in my congregation is what I call a permeable hermeneutic. I want them to have a hermeneutic that moves in back and forth with themselves, asking themselves questions, moving back into the social context and constantly moving back and forth, because if it's a hermeneutic that's rigid, it don't do them no good. They need to be able to have that hermeneutic to flow and to be able to touch lives in very different ways. So I often remind my congregation, because we are a congregation in movement, that I can't understand how they are so comfortable with creating a space for men and women who may have been incarcerated. You're comfortable with creating spaces for pimps. You're comfortable with creating, and they're not ex-pimps, like they pimps. They're comfortable creating space for people who, and I know we got the statistics about drugs, but how can you create space for a brother or sister who's actively selling crack cocaine to our communities? How can you create space for those individuals, but somebody who's gay, you can't create that space? That seems insane to me. And it's unbalanced and it's unjust. So I say your hermeneutic has to be able to permeate that. And so the next thing I try to do is I try to challenge them with what I call biblical literalism. Because one of the things that if they get up in the Spirit and then they get to a place and they say, well, my Bible tells me that this is so, right? And so I say, okay, after they ain't got their divine moment, that's on Sunday, but by Wednesday they listen to talking about, Pastor, I heard what you said. I bought the tape, so this is what it says. And so what I challenge him is I say, listen, the Bible is an instrument that is all about creating space and creating place. You cannot tell me that the Bible is meant to take away land. It's meant to expand it and to include people that everything else was included. So I tell them, I say, okay, I'm going to put it on your hat. I'm a biblical literalist. I believe everything the Bible says. The first thing I want to do and give permission to is to enter your black behind back into slavery. They're like, oh, hold on, Pastor. No. I said, no, let's be honest about it. Because if we're going to follow the Bible, every black body in this room that's telling me that this is the truth, all y'all need to go back and be happy slaves. Paul told you to be slave, be good slaves to your master. That's what Paul told you. God even gave permission for you to own slave. Jesus didn't say nothing bad about it. So that means that all the stuff you've been talking about, you won't be no slave no more. Guess what? Go get your chains on. It's time to get back into slavery. Go find your master. And of course, you know, they're going to look at me like I lost my mind. They think I'm crazy. I said, but that's what the Bible gives permission for, right? And I said, but listen to this. The Bible gives more permission for slavery than it does against homosexuality. So if you can choose to ignore all the sections permitting slavery, why is it that you want to hold on to those few verses that try to condone homosexuality? I said, it's your own bigotry, right? It's your own bigotry. And so then I pull up the church covenant that we use all the time. We recite it. It says this: we will walk together in Christian love, endeavoring to keep the unity of the Spirit in the Lord of peace, that we will bear one another's burdens in all humility, and accept one another as the Lord has accepted us. That's our own church covenant. And if we're not doing what we're supposed to do, how in the world are we going to talk about we're living up to what this covenant really means? So I'll end with this. So one of the things that, why this is such a challenge to me is because when my two sisters told me that they were gay, they said, it took them a long time, and they came to me and they said, you know, Brother Everett, my nickname is Squirt. I don't know why they call me, but I'm Squirt back home in Texas. And they say, Squirt, we want to tell you that, you know, we gay. Now, anybody who knows anything, girl, I've been knowing you gay a long time. I don't know why, you know what I'm saying? I ain't never seen you with a dude. You dressing finer than I'm dressing right now. You know, you on 10, pants starts hard, you know, all that good stuff. But what hurt me was that they said we were afraid to tell you because we didn't know how you would respond. And I had to tell them, I said, listen, I'm your brother. I love you more than anything else, who you are. I'm not worried about your sexual orientation, it's about who you are. And so I endeavor to make sure that any space that I have control over is a space that is welcoming to all those other spaces. And at any moment that my congregation tells me we don't want to make that a space, I tell them, all right, I can leave you. I will find my own space. And I promise you, when I walk out that door, I will take half those other people with me, and we will continue to create space. Because what I'm not about is living in a space where I permit injustice because I want to be silent because of how they pay me. Thank you.
Let the church say, amen. Now, I know everybody wasn't raised in the black church, but that felt real churchy to me, you know, little black preacher boy and seminarian. So, can we give our panel another hand? I can tell you, as a single black gay man living in Madison, Wisconsin, without a dog, a partner, or a child, this topic is quite personal for me, right? That I am more likely to be imprisoned in Dane County than to receive a PhD. Like, this is real. These numbers are real for me. And it can be, for all the brown people in the room, if we're honest, it can be real depressing to be here in Madison, Wisconsin, in Dane County. And if you are single and childless or partnerless, that's a whole, or dog and petless, it's a very different reality. And so, but it is spaces like this that kind of gives you the lifeline, as we say in the church, to hold on a little while longer. So I want to thank all of our guests, those of you who are presenting later, all of you for coming out and being with us this morning. We're looking forward to the rest of the afternoon. This is just a little foretaste. I'm really excited. During lunch, those of you who will be here with us during lunch, the tables, 10 of the tables will have a particular discussion topic. So if you heard something from one of our guests and you want to engage them a little more, you could try to find a spot at their table to engage them during that time, particularly if you can't make their own workshop or something like that. So we look forward to you. Thank you for being here. And one last thing, I wanted to give a special thank you to David Long from the UW Applied Laboratory. If you didn't get a chance to see the map, take a moment near the registration table. David sent me this map that he made of the racial ethnic breakdown of Dane County based on the last census. And if you haven't taken a moment, you should look at it. It's an interesting ditty. And I thought it was quite appropriate to look at green, green represents white identified people in Dane County. It's a whole lot of green. You don't have to get close. But if you try to find the African Americans or the Asian Americans or the Latino folks, you got to get real close to that map. And if you've seen it, it's huge. It's like, it's huge. So it's in the lobby near the registration table. So take a moment to spend some time with that. Have a great time in your sessions. And at this time, we're going to dismiss and let you get a break and find your sessions. And we look forward to speaking with you later. Most of the sessions are on the 3rd floor. And if you have any questions, stop, ask a staff member or the registration table staff.